Back in 2004, National Geographic hired a team to find the secret to long life. To go looking for pockets of people across the globe, fishing villages and religious towns where members lived freakishly long, where seeing 100 candles on your birthday cake wasn't just the norm, it was expected. And to head their team, they got an expert in lifespan, Dan Buettner. To everyone's surprise, Dan actually did it. Dan and several doctors tracked down the hidden communities around the world, dubbed the Blue Zones. These communities were Loma Linda, California, Nicoya, Costa Rica, Sardinia, Italy, Icaria, Greece, and Okinawa, Japan. To learn their secrets, Dan interviewed the members of these communities and turned the interviews into the book about extending human lifespan, The Blue Zones, Secrets for Longer Living. Dan even took his findings on Oprah, where he and Dr. Oz told millions of followers that the secret to reaching 100 was vegan dieting and active hobbies like gardening.
No smoking, no drinking, no eating meat or processed foods.
Dan also gave a TED Talk where he claimed that nature walks and social gatherings would save us all from dying early.
Here in Sardinia, the older you get, the more wisdom you're celebrated for. Instead of seeing the Sports Illustrated swimsuit calendar, you see the centenarian of the month calendar.
And Dan's finds were made into a recent Netflix documentary where Dan jokes with centenarians about how drinking wine can help you live past 99.
What's the best tea to drink on a daily basis?
Wine.
I like the way you roll.
If you know the format of our podcast, then you probably know what's coming next. It turns out the self-help guru who claimed that vegan diets, wine, and garden parties can keep you young forever isn't really an expert. And Dan's team kind of fudged the numbers. And by kind of, we mean cherry-picked the data that already support his vegan lifestyle books and brand. On today's episode, we'll talk about the doctors and the demographers who had been writing and working to undo 16 years of bunk blue zone claims. We'll explore the real blue zones here in America that have nothing to do with veganism or gardening. And we'll discuss the peer-reviewed geneticist who was able to prove with his own DNA that you can reverse your age by about 4 years, all without cutting meat from your diet. Stick around, because today's episode is one big fat myth and a lot of bust. You're listening to The Reengineered You. This is a podcast about self-empowerment and all the myths, lies, and misconceptions we tell ourselves. Then we use science and history to bust those myths and re-engineer a better you. I'm your host, Todd Laments, the extrovert.
And I'm the writer, researcher, and introvert, Joe Anthony, whose job it is to dig through the outer layer of no-duh on the internet. Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty, I just want to ask about our gullibility, if that's okay. Because we did an episode once about Ikigai, the philosophy, the Japanese philosophy of what gets you up in the morning, like what is your purpose and how important it is. But the book itself, Ikigai, talks about the blue zones. Like half the content of Ikigai seems like it is the book kind of delves into or recopies Dan's work, where it claims that these people live to 100 because they eat fresh vegetables every day, and they garden, and they have a rich social life, and they imbibe alcohol moderately. And I bought into it that way. I had no idea it was so huge on Oprah. So how much of Blue Zones had you heard about before doing this?
This has been something that I've heard about my whole life, and it wasn't just the Blue Zone stuff. It wasn't, Oprah didn't make it famous. For years, there'd be articles or magazine things written about in the newspaper and magazines written about this special place where the people eat all of this, and they look 20 years younger and they live longer. And for some reason, they always are doing gardening. It always shows them. It looks like one of those allergy commercials, you know, where they got floppy hats on and then these kind of cheesy smiles.
Right.
You know, and it's always been fascinating. You think, wow, if I could eat like that, I think that there's something in our DNA that says what we want: eternal life. We want to live forever, like a vampire, right?
Right. So I think I'm with you on that. The whole idea that blue zones have always been in sort of like the background of my mind of like this will make you live longer, and that eventually, if you get to older age, you slide into that lifestyle of doing all these things that will make you live to 110 or whatever. I I'm trying to think of a delicate way to put it. I always think I suspected uh, uh, um let's put it a different way. My buy-in was high. I because there's so much like truth in the blue zones myth. I was in like I recognize now that because it was liberally mixed with actual good studies, but also sort of like milkshake whipped together with stuff that is just blatant making up of facts, cherry picking of data.
I know where you're going with this. Aren't most good lies based in a lot of truth?
Thank you. Yes, you succinctly put what I was stumbling around. That is exactly what I'm talking about. Is
And I think it's important that for this episode not to say that because it's not 100% true doesn't mean these other things aren't important
right.
and true.
So that is actually that's a distinction I want to make right off the top. Is we're going to bust the original Blue Zone studies and myths and Oprah campaign that Dan went on, but we are going to talk about what is really effective. Like we now have really solid science that has been replicated in multiple universities, replicated in multiple countries, that shows exactly what you need to do to live a longer life. So we're going to cover that. We're going to talk about honestly the super underreported, underrepresented studies that show you how to live approximately 4 years longer. It's not a guaranteed centenarian. That's not what we're going to get to. Like if we're being realistic, we're going to help you reverse your age about 4 years, or so the studies go so far, which are still very early. But we are also going to, yeah.
Do you think both of us are a little more sensitive because we've had some pretty serious health issues?
I think we wouldn't be doing this episode if you and I hadn't had health scares. I think that
Yeah, 'cause you
our
don't think
blood
about
pressure, yeah, makes us think
Yeah,
about this.
you start thinking about how long am I going to be around,
I honestly, if we hadn't had health scares, we'd be Joe Rogan right now. We would just be like talking about caveman diet supplements and bone broth and weird shit like that. No, we're gonna hopefully get into the good science, and we're gonna take a lot of care in explaining why certain science was bunk, what is bunk science. I know everybody has heard way too much about it in the news recently, that like, how do we trust certain studies, like what makes a good study. We're not gonna break down what makes a good scholarly academic source, but we are going to talk about like why was Dan's stuff not trustworthy, why is the other stuff replicatable, and why should you trust it now. So let's kind of begin with um, what was your first impression of Dan? Like when you saw him in the clips and things like that, what did you think?
Very impressive, very, polished and genuine.
He kind of um, I used to have like in school professors that would be like they either looked one of two ways. There was a professor that looked very shabby, like they fit the model for a professor who like shows up wearing like wrinkled clothes and their hair is messy and they kind of like slouch and they have like a beer gut even though they don't drink. Or they go the other way. They look like they are so well put together they've got to have life figured out. There's no way they don't.
And what did you think with him?
Dan looks like a male model for a rogue like a hair coloring commercial. Like
I call that people. I used to say this when I was younger. I wish the guy wish I was with my father. I wish he's my dad. If he was my dad, I would be so much more successful than I am.
Right. Yeah, he the pictures of him, he's always got like a nice blazer and a white button collar that is unbuttoned, no tie, and that's the sign of success. If somebody's wearing a tie, it means they're trying to do business. If they have that white collar unbuttoned, it means business is done. They're retired. Like that's it is the sign for I've succeeded. He looks amazing. He speaks amazing. Everything he does in interviews and things, he's very polished, and I think that's the problem. I think both it gives a sense of confidence, in the data he is sharing and what he's talking about. But I had no idea that's what he did for a living beforehand. So can we talk about who is Dan and like what his background is real quick?
Yeah, please.
So
Every good biography goes back, right?
yeah, exactly. So before Dan started telling everybody how to live longer, he was not a expert in long life. We the start of this episode is kind of a joke. We talk about how he was, a lifespan expert. Really, what he was is he was an expert in Spanish literature. That's what he majored in at a Catholic college in Minnesota. And then he worked for journalism. Like he went into journalism, but he also kind of went into it from the recruiting and fundraising side. He used to convince celebrities to attend fundraising croquet tournaments. So like just imagine the good looking dude in a suit who shows up and you're Kim Kardashian and he says, "Hey, there's a croquet tournament. You don't have to be good at it, but you need to, could you show up, drum up some support and play?" And that's what he did. So he was the man behind the people. Um, and then he started breaking world records for Guinness. Like he went from fundraising to he started cycling across the world, and really truly impressive feats. Like he would cycle for tens of thousands of miles across continents and across Africa and Argentina. And he kind of through this like amazing cycling journey. Like he was the Forrest Gump on a bike. Like he could just cycle forever apparently. And he started getting a following. People followed him and asked, what do you do? Like how do you get that kind of endurance? What's your lifestyle choice? Your body is in amazing shape. What are you doing right? And so he started kind of like writing about it, and it was mostly vegan diet. A lot of sort of what's the old joke? How do you get a vegan to tell you that they're vegan? It's too late. They've already told you. That was his lifestyle brand. Is it was cycling and veganism. And then he kind of, from what I can tell, he took his followers and his fundraising abilities, and he approached National Geographic. They did not come to him, as far as I can tell.
He's a cold calling kind of guy, right? He doesn't need you to open the door for him. He started with you going into that. I'm thinking this sounds like the most world's interesting man kind of thing, you know. You know what I mean? Like he won the Tour de France and he doesn't even ride a bikes kind of guy, you know.
Right? Yeah, he is a beer commercial. That's well, that's what I could tell is he was so interesting. He was able to get National Geographic. Usually, National Geographic they do give out grants and things like that, and they do give out research. They do assign research to people, but from what I've seen, usually their writers are like scientists and journalists and science journalists like Malcolm Gladwell. Um, this guy approached them and said, "Hey, I've traveled everywhere. I want to do a paper about how to live the longest." He's like, "I've noticed through my cycling and world traveling, there are just groups of people who live really, really long." And to their credit, National Geographic said, "Get a team together, get some scientists together, and prove it, show us, and we'll publish it." And he did that, in his sort of like a showman fundraising way. He started approaching different groups. He went to University of Minnesota, pitched to them. He got academic support. He went to the National Institute of Aging, pitched to them. He got a grant. He basically just went on tour and got people to buy in. And he got doctors from the NIA and the University of Michigan to basically like help him with the data and provide information and sort of team up with him. But he kind of twisted all the data back to his veganism and cycling. This is effectively why we're doing this episode. Is it took we're gonna link off to their articles, but there is a demographer who wrote about this. There's also we have an article by Gideon Merowitz Katz, who's an epidemiologist at Wollongong, and they, like them, but also other real scientists, have tried to replicate his studies. We're going to link to his original article too. His team published in the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine, which is a prestigious peer-reviewed journal. However, after they published, people couldn't replicate it. So the way you know that a study is a good study, but also a one-off, it's a fluke, is you can't replicate it. And some of the colleges in the countries he visited have tried. We'll have an article linking to the College of Cyprus, where they were unable to produce his findings. They tried to look into these pockets of blue zones where, they find all these centenarians who are living extra long despite every county around them dying at 50 or 60 or whatever. And here's what they said. They said, despite the preliminary evidence derived from observational studies in BZ, up to date, there has not been a specific scientific explanation regarding the exceptional advantage of survival of the inhabitants of the longevity of blue zones, which is likely a result of a combination of various behavioral and genetic factors. Therefore, there is an urgent need for conducting in-depth interdisciplinary comparative studies in the blue zones, and coupled with the implementation of comprehensive lifestyle behavior intervention studies in the general population. AKA, they couldn't figure out where Dan got all his information. And the best they could figure out is that there's a bunch of factors going on. And they very generously said there just needs to be more studies about blue zones because it doesn't add up. However, what the demographer says and what Katz says is that it's just bullshit. Dan just cherry picked what he wanted, and we don't know exactly where. Which takes me to Todd, because you went through his actual claims, and that's probably what everybody is waiting and listening for is what did he say about blue zones? What did he say about long lifespan? And what are the ones he kind of like was pushing?
Well, the big ones being the places that they were in, there was huge holes in all of them that you don't have to dig too deep. Okinawa, Japan was one, and this was kind of interesting because how they handpicked the data here was they kind of picked it from a long time ago. So they picked it from a year, I think it was in the early 80s, when the economy was just booming. And there was huge growth. There was very, very healthy food. And then what happened was it boomed and then it kind of bust. A lot of the industry went away and people moved away. The education system. So it used to be a great place to live. Now it's an extremely unhealthy place to live. So they're basing it off. And you see this a lot in sports, Joe. This is funny what they'll say about, let's say they'll take a football player and they'll say, since October 2022, he is the best at this. But if you go back just one more week, he's towards the worst. Does that make sense?
Okay. This slightly reminds me of I remember an article came out years ago where it claimed that Native Americans in America were the healthiest, most like food-wise grounded people on Earth, and it was all based on data from old Native American tribes, not new ones, like not recent ones, because
not
we
eating
all
at Pizza Hut every day.
Yeah,
right.
Reservations are now the hotbed of diabetes and economic unfairness, and it's and everybody dies young. Like it's basing things on old data does not take into hardships imposed by outside forces and by inequality. So like, yes,
I think this is something that everyone's done where we think about when we were in the best shape of our life and how much money we used to make at our old job.
That's a really good way of putting it.
Another one, of course, this one's closer to home. So I like this one, the Loma Linda. Now, a lot of the studies were based on the area where the people lived and how the people, like genetics, right? The people were raised in this healthy place, this blue zone.
Right.
They were taught to be active by their grandparents, and everyone does the same job, right? That was kind of this tribal living, kind of implied, right? Well, Loma Linda is unique, Joe, because everyone moved there. So they're transplants from other places, which is very odd. So they're different ethnicities. They're because they're trying to put it on. Maybe it's a racing. Maybe the first thing they went to was Asian, and they said no, it's not that. They figured that right away. Then it can't be Eastern Europeans because they drink too much, and then that fell through. So the Seventh Day Adventists. But do you know anything about Seventh Day Adventists, Joe?
Oh, not really. I'm going to guess that they are anti. No, I'm thinking pescatarian. Never mind. I was thinking anti-meat, anti-alcohol, but
They are anti-meat, which would fall into Buettner's thing. They're just very healthy. They're very diet driven for a religion. No drinking, no smoking, and eating very well. Very few religions talk about what you eat, besides bread and wine, right?
right.
But they're different. So, and then they were saying, well, does having faith in something actually is shown to make you live longer? To believe, which seems funny to me, which is counterintuitive to me, because if you had a lot of faith, you think, why wouldn't I want to die if I'm gonna go to heaven?
Right.
But I thought that was interesting. So they're just healthier people. But again, it was a screenshot. It's a screenshot.
Okay. So to kind of like recap that point a bit, we know that having faith does actually make you live longer, or not necessarily like faith in God, but faith in general. And so does an active social life. But you can't take data from this instance because so many people were transplants, and it
So many healthy people were.
okay.
So they still had these core values when they're other places. Does that make sense? It'd be like going to an Olympic training camp and say, "Oh, these people are all in good shape." Well, fuck, of course they are.
Right.
They're all Olympic athletes. These people don't drink, smoke, and they do things together and they're active. Well, yeah, if you get a bunch of them together, they are going to be healthier.
Yeah, but blaming
No,
it on the
duh.
location, like being like, what is it about this
Right.
Olympic village here that is making these healthy people? It's like, no, they all had a lot of money and they all came here. They all immigrated because they wanted to live in this gated community, basically.
And we know Joe's he's done research for many more years than I have, but he talked about these case studies where they take 100 college kids from, Harvard,
Right.
in the prime of their life, and say, and then base, millions of dollars of research on that.
Right. They call it the weird studies. It's white, educated, intelligent, something, something. It's basically your in-depth, detailed, groundbreaking study in psychology is less believable if you are only looking at white, educated, upper class people who are attending Yale. Like you can't take a bunch of Yale grads and interview all of them and say that is a sample of all of humanity across the globe. It just doesn't work. Like that's selecting for your data. And that kind of feels like that's to do the first bust. That seems like that's what Dan was doing. Is he was going to communities where people, or a community in this instance, Loma Linda, where, like you said, they transplanted there and they chose to live there. And of course, that's going to pre-select for like people who have enough wealth to transplant and people who have enough faith to form a social bond like that. So like there's already healthy things going on there. They didn't get raised there, like they didn't grow up there.
Well, speak and
yeah.
on to your point, another place that's probably my favorite of all of them is Monaco. Have you heard of this country, Monaco?
Not in this circumstance, no.
Well, it's been seen to have people who are living there a very long time. Now, to give you some perspective on this, it's a tiny country. It's bordered by France, and it's only got 38,000 residents, but it's a filthy, filthy rich country, and people live longer here. To give you some perspective, the average income in America household is 79,000. Here, it's 187,000. So and everyone knows America's already a rich country, right? It's a lot richer.
Yeah.
Well, they were saying that people live longer. Well, people live longer here and in communities like this. First of all, there's 38,000 residents. So it's the size of that's not even a big city by most standards in the world. But what do you get when you have a lot of people with a lot of money? The healthcare, Joe, is phenomenal.
Right.
And so you can buy quality of life. You can't buy quality of life, but you can by quantity of life. And a lot of times in countries like this too, there's a lot of experimental medicines that you can try. So they will keep everyone alive longer. It might not be a quality of life. So that's another cherry picked, like, no da.
Right. So that kind of brings us to almost like our ultimate answer of what is a real blue zone. A real blue zone where people didn't transplant, people didn't fudge numbers, where people live a long, long time, but it's not necessarily tied to like them loving to garden and drink wine on Sunday. The real blue zone is wealth. It's I hate to have another episode end with
Social
socioeconomics.
stuff.
But yeah, the communities that were true blue zones that Dan visited, where the studies bear out that yes, they lived a long time. It's because it was an exceptionally wealthy community, and they can just afford very good medical care into their old age. Um, and that's I know you kind of already talked about Okinawa, Japan, and busted it, but like you said, Okinawa leads Japan in child poverty, infectious disease, murders per capita. In the book Ikigai, they mention that they love to garden, which is kind of impossible because they have like it's either the second or third least amount of garden space of any
I was gonna
city in
say
Japan.
it's just city, right? It's just
Yeah,
like
it's just
Manhattan.
concrete everywhere.
Yeah. So that's really lying, right? What you're saying, like,
Yeah. Um, now the other fun parts of this are now why or how did the numbers get twisted in America or not just Loma Linda but like the other blue zones. Why would anybody? How did they have so many old people and why would they lie? Well, it turns out I don't know if you came across this, but did you come across the Japanese census data?
no.
So the article from the demographer talked about how a lot of these blue zones where people are self-reporting to be over 100. One of them was in Japan. You mentioned the 80s, and a lot of the data comes from the 80s. It's because after World War II, the census data that was being taken about populations were done by American aid groups, and so they were basically like setting up booths where people would show up or offices where people would show up. And because all the data had been lost during the war, like we bombed them twice, people would show up and just self-report how old they were and what they were, their age, how many family members they had, how much aid and relief they needed, like how much bags of wheat they needed to survive. And it behooved them to report themselves as older. Um,
Also, they get more benefit, like food or more some kind of resources.
Yeah, or they would be able to work, like they'd be able to get jobs in the relief effort. So for whatever reason at that time, apparently people were coming in and reporting their age as older. And the same kind of happens in America. Like you get areas where people would report themselves as being 105 or 110. And weirdly enough, all these blue zones where people are like super old, the freakish blue zones where people are really old are also areas with poverty, like with poverty and relief efforts and with social programs that would help them if they report an older age. Ikaria, Greece, where he found the blue zones, apparently they had a system where they could have family members who could apply for a parent's not social security, their retirement benefits or whatever. And so after the Secrets of the Blue Zones came out, parts of Greece went through and retook census data and found that a lot of the centenarians that they were reporting on had passed, they were dead, and that the families were still claiming them and claiming their retirement benefits.
Okay, so the actual stats were way off. So some of the people who said they were checked in were 10 were, they said they were 15 or 16 or whatever they said, and then a lot of people are dead. Well, if you take those numbers, those outliers out, that changes the averages quite a bit, pretty fast, right?
Right, exactly. We talked about Okinawa, Japan having all these things that are completely fly in the face of Ikigai and the Blue Zones myth. The American cities, usually it's something similar where like a hurricane came through, swept away data, and they had to like they lied about it for benefits and age and things like that. So these quote unquote blue zones, they're either places like Loma Linda where it's an extremely religious group and they control what they eat very very closely, or it is a total like it is the opposite of what we're saying. It's instead of being very well covered health coverage wise, they are in dire straits, an impoverished area. There's high crime, and they're lying on data because they need the assistance. Um, so again, it didn't take much. Like it took less work to find this data and to put together the census information than it took to debunk the bullshit train that has started with Dan and Oprah and his campaign and his fundraising. Like it double checking and doing extra studies wasn't much. Like it seems like the studies that came out were pretty easy. The colleges that were doing them were not like the best funded colleges necessarily. It just means that the lying and the story was so big and so popular and had so much momentum that that's all they've been fighting. It's like throwing real studies under the wheels of the train as it just careens forward and keeps going and keeps taking people with it. And so people are falling for this shit. Like there are people who are falling for blue zone myths still, and they are drinking wine on the weekends and holding garden parties and faith gatherings and they're doing things that aren't bad and in part are good. They're just not accurate, not even a little bit for some of it. Like the veganism thing. He really, really pushed veganism. Like that was his whole crux: is if you eat vegan, you live to 100. Period. And we now have good data that says not really.
Do you think that his core values kind of just, he kind of had that helper's high that he just started to see things that weren't there? Or do you think this was scam? I mean, how much of it is, you said there's a lot of good in the teachings.
Yeah. Okay. So I've got theories about this, and I think it is helper's high. I also think it is. This all worked very, very, very well for him. Like when you think about it, if I get on a new diet and I feel 10% better, I tell everybody about it. I'm like, this is amazing. Everybody, you got to try it. Think about it from his perspective, where he got on a new diet and he could cycle 10,000 miles. Like he got on this diet lifestyle trend system of living and he basically became Superman. I would be as emphatic as he is. I'm not calling Dan a liar in a sense of like he's just doing it for the greed and the money in the book, which he kind of did. I also think of it as how motivating would that be if you got that healthy and that had that much literal momentum behind you that you could go across Africa and not tell people about it. So I honestly don't blame him on a moral level, and there is enough truth in there that I think it was beneficial, at least more beneficial than nothing. But just twisting the data like that, it's at this point doing more harm than good because there's better stuff out there. And speaking of better stuff, do you want to start talking about the real studies about longevity they're currently coming out?
Yeah, the one that's going to give us 4 more years.
Absolutely.
I
wish
4 more years.
I wish it was more extreme. I wish we could do this podcast and I could like promise everybody like 20 more years. You will reverse your age. Yeah.
It doesn't floor you. It doesn't.
No. But that's kind of how health works, right? Like anything that's good for you, like hygiene, it's boring.
You're gonna live to see one more Olympics.
Yeah. One more presidential race. Good Lord.
Exactly.
And I also want to point out, and I know this is being surface and a little bit judgmental, just a tiny bit, but it's funny. Compare Dan, who looks just incredible. Like I said, this guy is just an unbuttoned white shirt and a blazer that grew an amazing lock of hair. Like that is what Dan is. Compared to the
one
actual,
of his conversations could be a TED Talk, right?
Yeah,
anything
exactly. Compare that to the actual longevity scientist who is seriously breaking the internet and seriously doing God's work in extending life is Steve Horvath. Steve Horvath is exactly what I described when I talked about college professors. He is like a little bit gangly, a little bit pudgy. He's balding, like his hair is receding. He is not the person you would think of like, well, this guy's going to live forever. And he's got sort of like a German or Austrian accent, so it's like he sounds like a scientist. Um, but no, he's tracking. We're going to do an entire episode on what's called epigenetics and DNA methylation. But to be very, very brief about it before we do an entire hour episode, which is coming up next week or the following, Steve Horvath tracks um, DNA methylation. Now, what that is it's a switch on your DNA that can be switched on or off. And everybody used to think up until like about 20 years ago, everybody thought DNA was set in stone. Your genetic code is concrete. You can't change it. You're born with what you have. You work with what you have. Period. And recently, in the last 20 years, we started finding out that there's little switches that will turn off and on to help you survive. If you go through a massive starvation period, like there's just no food, you're in say you're in Poland during World War II, and the Nazis roll through and they scorch the land, burn the crops, leave you with literally nothing for a couple of years. You will have methylation in your DNA that switches on or off for high stress and for no food, and those switches will change your hormone levels so that you don't get hungry as often. They'll change your caloric burn rate so you don't need as many calories to survive. This is what Todd and I talked about when we did our episode about The Biggest Loser. We talked about Biggest Loser contestants who they messed up their hormone levels by basically starving themselves, and now they only need 1,200 calories a day to survive, and it's ruining their lives. That's a methylation response. That is epigenetic. That is their DNA, like pulling the brakes, like the cord to like stop the train on their metabolism, because it's like, oh my god, we're starving, we're gonna starve forever, let's lower the amount of calories we need. And he calls this rust on the DNA, which I thought was freaking amazing. He says that his team of scientists track methylation like they're looking for rust along the DNA, because there are so many of these little switches that get switched for how much nurturing you get, how much oxytocin you get released throughout your lifetime, stress, age, diet. If you don't
And
exercise enough,
when you get it too, right? It's time sensitive.
right? Exactly. It is very time sensitive. Again, we'll cover some of this. We'll get into the stories of how we found all this stuff out in the next episode. But there's one that he found where if you are 8 or 9 and you starve badly, your children will not have heart disease. Like something about the way they're, an 8 or 9-year-old, if they starve, it switches a switch and it carries over to your children and grandchildren, and it tells them that, hey, you need to metabolize fats better. So like there are things that you can switch in your DNA that will carry over to your kids and your grandkids.
That's troubling me about this episode too, is this whole thing of, because it seems like if you're in these places where you do have a healthier life diet wise, and gluttony is less of a sin because it's just not available, us cheeseburger eating Americans shouldn't be able to live longer just because we have blood pressure medication to keep us going.
Right.
Right? Doesn't it seem like kind of the Spartan life should pay its benefits long term?
Well, yeah, that and like Ozempic, like now we can get fat and then we can take a shot to reduce our weight. And but then that also brings into question of like, did we earn our bad health? Like did we make those choices? Or like what is it, Daniel Kahneman and his idea of nudging? Did we make the default choices all bad choices because companies paid to put them on the menu? Like we had an episode about how we talked about how Kraft Lunch put Lunchables in school menus as a default, and it was seen as sort of like, it's currently being battled about right now, because some congressman got paid off somewhere.
They were less healthy than the ones that they had in the store,
Right?
For the kids. Yeah.
So regardless of how you screw yourself up, if you made these bad choices, or if you earned your high blood pressure like I did, or if you just grew up in a bad neighborhood, you were in a food desert and the closest thing was McDonald's, that was designed for you by companies or if you live in a great area and you just want to live a little bit longer, you're not in a blue zone, you're in a normal zone. How do you use his data about methylation to extend your life? That's what he tried to do. He wanted to track life. He invented what was called the age clock in DNA. And with this age clock, originally he was hired, by the way, this is very funny to me. He was hired to find out if something in your DNA will tell you what your sexual preference is. So, like, the college that hired him was like, "You're a genius. Figure out if there is a gay gene or a straight gene or a bisexual gene. Like, go in and look for that, please." And this is what he found: is he found the ability to track methylation, the amount of rust on your DNA. And then he found out that if you take all the rust and count it, you can figure out how old somebody is. Not super impressive. Basically, you if you sent in your blood to him, or I think they still run this process. If you send in your blood, he can tell you how old you are just by counting how many of these particles of rust are on your DNA. But it gets better. He can do this with any mammal now. Like, his lab now can do this with your house cat. If you send in your dog's DNA, they can be like, your dog is 6 years, 4 months, 3 days, like whatever. And he can tell you how old you are internally. Like, you send in your DNA, like you're doing a 23andMe. He will come back and be like, you are 63 years old and a couple of months, and you shouldn't have eaten that turkey burger last week. Um, but then he was like, okay, if we have the information for how old people are, what can we do to knock the rust off your DNA? Like, what can we do to reverse aging, basically? So he went from, his lab was getting paid a modest amount to find out what your sexual what your sexual preferences are in your DNA, and it went to, we're tracking age, to how can we reverse aging. So, like, he earned his money and his lab over and over and over again by doing this. He now has what's called an grim age prediction model, which will tell you how long you have based on your internal age. And there are people who naturally age slower, and he talks about this in his TED talk. If you're in the top 5% of agers, meaning you age very slowly, you have half the mortality rate. So naturally, just straight off the rip, you might be one of these slow agers, and you might have the ability to just live. You have half the rate of dying as somebody else, basically. So if you want to hit 110,
That's pretty good, Al. I like
don't
that.
live. Yeah,
flip a coin with you and me. I like that. I'll take that.
right. Yeah, don't live in a blue zone. Be one of these top 5% of agers genetically. That'll help you. We can all take that advice, right?
I was gonna say, yeah, be great to be born with stuff. That's like social class too, right? You're born with it, right?
Yeah, you're born with it. Well, there are things you can do, and this is we're not doing an if we started this episode and I didn't have an answer to what you can physically do to change your age, we wouldn't have an episode. Here's what he did.
It better not be gardening. It better not.
It's not. It's not gardening. It's not drink wine and socialize on the weekends, like Dan's advice. It's not go vegan. Here's his advice: eat less bread and pasta and more frozen vegetables. Now this isn't advice in quotes. This isn't a self-help guru. If you listen to his advice and you listen to his talks, he says this is all early. He's not going out on an Oprah show. He is telling everybody, hold your damn horses. We're still breaking in the science. This needs time. Like, this is a study that was replicated and people were able to confirm our findings, but it's still early. We're going to do better. But he had his subjects eat less bread and pasta, more frozen vegetables. Note that he did not say cut out meat. He probably moderated their meat. I think in one of the papers I was reading, they didn't go above 8 ounces or something like that. Higher doses of cholesterol drugs for people who are at risk, statins specifically. Now, one of the doctors, we're going to link off to. Yeah,
that's counter to what we always hear, isn't it? Less pills is standard as it gets, isn't it?
Right. well, that's what you hear from a self-help guru. Will tell you, you have all the medicine in you that you need. Just tell the universe.
Exactly.
Yeah. No. If you are at a high risk category, take your damn medicine. Take your.
And
meds.
Even Tony Robbins says that. Like, just drink water and breathe deeper. And just very, very primal, basic.
Yeah. It would be lovely to believe that, and there is some truth to that. If you hydrate and you breathe
Yeah.
deep and exercise and meditate. All these things lower your cortisol and your stress. So like these advices that we're getting from the Dans of the world and the Tony Robbinses of the world, they're not bad advice. You should do them, but they're not going to make you live longer as proven by science. As proven by science, if you're at risk, take a statin. Here's a quote by Dr. Neil Stone, who broke this article for Business Insider. He says, quote, "Statin should not be put in the water for everyone." And he's a cardiologist from Northwest University. And he said, "We're very clear that statins work to do two things. They lower LDL, which is bad cholesterol, and they also lower inflammation. That's a very powerful combination in people at risk." So, and when we say people at risk, a lot of the people who are trying to live to 100, they're already like 60 or 70. They're already thinking about this stuff. So like, don't start putting your teenagers on statins. But if you are in this age group we're talking about, yes, if you need to lower your cholesterol, if you need an anti-inflammatory, talk to your doctor about statins. Here's another thing. Horvath put his participants in the lab group on a 5 vitamin combo. He gave them more vitamin D. He gave them more zinc. He gave them more fish oil, garlic, and cruciferous vegetable supplements. I'd never heard of this. What is a cruciferous vegetable supplement?
I can't think or say, or no, I don't know.
I'm gonna look it up real quick. It's just a green mix. It combines extracts of broccoli, cabbage, and other phytonutrients.
Cruciferous. Maybe I can't
Yeah.
say that. This
Put
is
them
why he
on.
doesn't have his own Netflix special. He can't
I know,
dumb this stuff
because
down,
you can't.
right?
Yeah, you can't pronounce this shit. Yeah, the Netflix special with Dan is joking with an old lady about keep drinking your red wine, old woman. But the 5 vitamin combo seems really important. So even though you are eating vegetables, he got his people to eat frozen vegetables instead of bread and pasta as much, and he also put them on these 5 vitamin supplements. He also had them go for a brisk walk uphill, specifically 30 minutes every day after dinner. Like the timing was important. And you and I know for our blood pressure, you and I know that an uphill walk or a 30-minute a day cardio is absolutely necessary. Like
But what
it doesn't.
it isn't the marathon running like we see,
No,
right?
you don't have to.
This isn't the 80-year-old who's doing the cold plunges and is in the bikini and saying, "I've had 5." This is not that. It's not that extreme.
No,
This is consistent, and this is something you could do, right?
right. This isn't eat a vegan diet and cycle across Africa. This is, yeah, if you go out for an uphill walk quickly, 30 minutes every day after dinner, then it seems to have the most beneficial effect.
I think if you said that to the health people that I hang around with, that they could have frozen vegetables, they would slap you. I think there'd be a violent action,
Right.
But it's true, right? It makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, it depends on like some vegetables lose some of their nutrients when you freeze them. Some of them don't. Some of them lose the most nutrients when you boil them. Some of them don't. So like it depends on the vegetable. But these are just the things that he could come up with for his study group that he could put volunteers under. Like this is what he could do with volunteers to make it consistent. So it'd be easy enough for them to do.
And
So
that's not
he could
too
study
intense.
them.
It's not too intense. It's consistent, but not too intense. I think it's important, right?
In this clinical study, he reversed all of their ages by an average of 2.5 years. Now he did this himself. Like he took his own advice, and I think he was more consistent following it. And I think he has been more consistent in taking his own advice, obviously. And if you're the man who invents the ability to de-age yourself, don't you want to do your own thing? He has tested his own blood. He has had his lab test him. He has had other labs test him. And he has so far shaved 4 years off of his biological age. So it is small things that work, but they have to be done rigorously, consistently, and it has to be done in a way where you can repeat it without getting sick of it.
See, I like what you just said. I like the idea of being 4 years younger right now than being 4 years at the end. The deferred payment.
Yeah.
Because I don't know if I want to live longer than that. I see some of my neighbors. The median age in my neighborhood is about 80, and I don't want to live. I don't know if I want to live that long.
I wonder. You and I
have
talked.
productive years where I can do stuff still. Where I still want to do that. I still have the will and desire.
Right. Okay. So that's an important part, and I'd kind of like to let this be the thing we leave off on. Horvath is old. Like, he's not really old, but like he's balding. He's older. He's a professor. What happens to somebody when you start doing this in their younger years, in their 30s and 40s? What happens to somebody when you do these 5 or 6 steps and you start it early and you are consistent for that long, like forever? Like, you brush your teeth forever. Like you start teaching kids to brush their teeth, and this goes beyond telling kids eat your vegetables, because a lot of parents who say eat your vegetables, they also give them cookies and breads and all the other things that they will normally have. What happens if you teach them to go for a 30-minute walk every day after dinner? What happens if you say, okay, we brush our teeth, now we take our vitamins and they're in a pill box, and you always get the habit of refilling it, instead of having these be a New Year's resolution that you eventually drop? What happens if we instill these as lifelong habits, and we don't give Lunchables to teenagers in school as a default? Like, I mean, this old man knocked 4 years off his biological age. I'm with you. I want what you're saying. What if we knock those 4 years off early, and we get that much more productive time? I believe that we would have. I think the whole world would be a blue zone if everybody could follow this, and there's good science behind it, and it's not just be vegan and garden parties and all this crap. It's there are real things you can do, and I like that.
I like that too, John. I like the message, and I think if we all had 4 more years of productive, healthy years, how better would the world be, right? If all of us felt better for 4 years and did better, that'd be great.
Make the whole world a blue zone. And until then, you and I are going to Monaco. We're going to live in a very rich village, and we're going to get the best health coverage.
I have a feeling we're going to be serving people there. We're going to be the help. We're going to bring down the average income in that country.
I'm in.